Coming up, John Kerry goes to China, but Washington and Beijing aren't the best of friends. Can this climate envoy get the world's two biggest polluters to work out their differences in time to make a difference?
This could be the beginning of a new definition of cooperation.
Attacks on climate protesters continue after activists in Germany glue their hands to tarmac. But first, the heat is on.
The heat is horrible.
We'll give you a breakdown of the effect extreme temperatures have on your body.
Normally it's August where it's 39, 40 degrees, but the last 2-3 years I've been here, it's just been gradually getting hotter and hotter in July.
This is Just 2 Degrees on TRT World. Hey, a lot of people are feeling the heat this summer. Yes, it's normally hot this time of year in much of the northern hemisphere, but not like this. Temperatures surpassed a whopping 50 degrees Celsius, a record in some places. Frankly, people are losing their minds. Authorities warn we risk getting heat stroke, dehydration, and other heat-related issues if we stay out in the sun too long. So outings are risky, particularly for the elderly. But staying indoors isn't comfortable either, especially if you can't afford air conditioning.
The heat is horrible. It's wet.
Yeah, it was sweltering, very hot.
I prefer like a cooler climate. If you want to take exercise, hike, and do those things, it's impossible in the kind of heat they have in the south.
Well, I'm ready to go back to my hotel instead of walking around.
So walking just from the car over here, something that would take us just a few minutes. We needed 2 bottles of water because it was that hot.
この頃から比べるとやっぱり5度ぐらい上がってますね。だからこのまま行ったら本当にこの辺がもう赤道直下のね地帯と同じような状態になっちゃうんじゃないか心配します。
You have to change your way of living to adapt to that kind of weather.
Y de hecho también nos hace un poco modificar, que ya para el año que viene estábamos pensando en quizás mover a junio las vacaciones un poquito antes para
que haga menos calor.
Para que haga menos calor y estar más a gusto, porque eso con autocaravana pues no suele haber aire acondicionado si estás parado.
I cry all the time. I like yell at the heat to like go away, or just now my friend came to check on me and I couldn't stop sweating. I'm supposed to be going to do laundry, but I can't stop sweating to get the laundry together. So it's pretty hard.
This is very hot, and like when it's a beautiful weather and the ocean is so calm, it's so tempting to go and swim in the ocean, but at the same time you can like easily go in there.
It's changed a lot. I've been coming here for 8-9 years maybe, and it's got a lot hotter in July. Normally it's August where it's 39, 40 degrees, but the last 2-3 years I've been here, it's just been gradually getting hotter and hotter in July.
So I try to cover if I swim, like I'm always wearing thin wetsuit, even like leggings and anything like long sleeves will definitely help. And it's pretty nice in the water, but if you're not swimming in the ocean, I think it's better to hide indoors.
It's really difficult to walk in, so yeah, no.
We have to go home for a shower.
Yeah.
Extreme heat is Arizona's natural disasters. So for the Salvation Army, this is a disaster response. Today we are tying a record 18 straight days of 110 degrees or more. And there's no end in sight. People out here are suffering. People out here are struggling. And it's important for the Salvation Army to continue to provide this service because it's life-saving. Some ice cold water, a hat, some sunscreen, anything like that is a lifeline for people in need that are living here out in these conditions.
Without water, we'll be, like in the hospital right now for dehydration. And I thank the people for helping out a lot because without them, we'll be like very sick and like I can't imagine.
I love the heat, so personally it's been great. A little too hot because I've never been this sweaty at once, but I like it. It's kind of why we came here though too, like to be at the beach and like sweat and be in the warmth. So get a little tan going, can definitely get a tan if you're on the beach, but the breeze, though, helps out a lot.
Pienso que la gente todavía no es consciente del cambio climático. Es increíble que ya en el siglo XXI sigan negando el cambio climático y es cierto que con altas temperaturas lo que hacemos es empeorarlo, ponemos todavía más fuerte el aire acondicionado y dormimos tapados, nos duchamos más frecuentemente, echamos más ropa a lavar, la crema solar también, que si te bañas en cualquier sitio también es perjudicial, no hacemos nada por el cambio climático.
Well, the World Economic Forum recently gave some insight on how the human body responds to extreme heat. Firstly, our heart rate rises. As the blood vessels open, our blood pressure drops. When that happens, the heart has to work harder. To get more specific, for every 0.5 degrees Celsius rise in our body's core temperature, our heart rate goes up 10 beats per minute, which could result in feeling lightheaded. When core temperature rises, our skin also flushes and the blood vessels open. This actually helps us lose body heat and cool off. But it can also cause symptoms like heat rash and swollen feet.
That's like when it's the worst.
When the blood vessels open, we also sweat more, which cools the bodies as it evaporates from the skin. But there is a downside to that. Sweating too much can lead to dehydration and the loss of key electrolytes. This explains why we crave water when we sweat a lot. Combined with low blood pressure, dehydration can cause heat exhaustion. Symptoms that include cramps, dizziness, nausea, confusion, and fainting. And we can't forget humidity. If it's very humid, sweating becomes less effective and does not cool the body. That can lead to heat stroke when the core body temperature rises past 40 degrees Celsius.
I've drank about 6 of these since morning, and I'm still drinking more up till the time I'll close from work.
This can result in hallucinations and seizures. Vital organs like the liver and kidney begin to shut down, and the heart can go into cardiac arrest. Doctors say if someone is confused, uncoordinated, has a fit, or is still unwell after 30 minutes of resting and cooling off, or if they stop sweating and their skin becomes hot and dry to the touch, they may have heat stroke and be in need of medical attention. The World Economic Forum says every year heat waves kill more people than hurricanes, lightning, tornadoes, floods, and earthquakes combined. To safely cool off, put your feet in cold water. This gradually reduces the body's core temperature and keeps the organs working. A lukewarm shower also helps. But suddenly immersing the body in cold water is not advised and can be dangerous. A sudden drop in temperature could result in thermal shock. You know what, scientists are warning about the potential impact of unprecedented ocean temperatures around the US state of Florida. Temperatures should be between 22 and 31 degrees Celsius. Instead, they've been as high as 35 this July. The situation is putting coral reefs under extreme stress and in danger of bleaching, and they are home to millions of species of marine life. These coral reefs support healthy ocean food chains, and they also protect coastlines. Experts are working on developing new techniques to try and save them.
Some of our long-term monitoring sites here off of Miami are starting to show signs of early coral bleaching. So they're starting to pale and losing their their algal pigments, and eventually we expect them to bleach fully. But along this stabilized shoreline here where we have riprap or large boulders, we have corals that have settled and are thriving. These corals are some of the healthiest that I have seen all over Miami, and they grow incredibly large and seem to be healthy. And so the work that we're doing and what brought us out here today is we're trying to figure out how these corals have been able to survive and whether or not we can use those same mechanisms to make them be successful as part of coral restoration. So can we take corals from the port and bring them and repopulate some of our reefs that have been decimated? It's certainly not going away, and all of our predictions and forecasts are expecting it to only get worse through time. And so what this means is that now is the time for action. We can't just be observing anymore and watching the decline of coral reef ecosystems. We need to be active participants in trying to save them.
And along with the extreme summer heat come wildfires. We saw from the fumes from the fires in Canada, air quality declines significantly. Air pollution, well, it's a mixture of gases and particles and are very dangerous when inhaled, as Sarah Commodore explains. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health in the School of Public Health at Indiana University.
What is most concerning about this year's wildfire season is the impact on air quality.
Air pollution is a mixture of gases and particles. And these particles, for example, particulate matter with an aerodynamic diameter of 2.5 microns or less, PM 2.5 for short, is known to be very dangerous for inhalation purposes. So it's small, it penetrates deep into the lungs, and that affects your health overall, not just lung health, but overall health. One thing I would like to stress is this PM 2.5, this particulate matter, when it goes deep into your lungs, it causes inflammation or even oxidative stress in your lungs. And so there's so many issues that happen when all these particles are moving through your body. On the short-term side, you can have coughing, wheezing, watery eyes, scratchy throat. Those are some of the symptoms that are associated with air pollution exposures with wildfire. Long-term basis, you can have increase in things like asthma, exacerbations, or even hospital visits because people are having all kinds of serious health consequences and they might not understand. To protect your health and during the wildfire season, it's important to understand 4 things. 1, know the air quality index in your area. You can do this by going to airnow.gov, run by the US EPA. Type in your zip code and see what the conditions are. You can also download an app by them, Smoke Sense, and it's easy to be able to understand the wildfires that might be happening in that area. 2, know the symptoms that are associated with these exposures. And so if you're having coughing, wheezing, watery eyes because there's smoke, know that these are associated with exposure from these wildfire smoke. 3rd, always know that you can protect yourself. So avoid that exposure. If you don't have to be outside, don't be outside. But if you are outside, put on a mask. That's great. Secondly, if you're having to do that because you're an outside worker, an outdoor worker, well, then there can be protection by rotating workers, for example. So some people can come in and out. Thirdly, and then the last point is just be able to talk to your healthcare provider about it if you're experiencing any kind of symptoms.
U.S. climate envoy John Kerry and the Chinese Premier Li Qiang met in Beijing in July to address the problem of climate change. But it's a sensitive time. Ties between the two nations are at historic lows because they disagree on tariffs, technology, Taiwan sovereignty, and human rights. But both Kerry and Li made statements calling for environmental cooperation.
当前这个全球应对气变问题面临了很大的一些挑战，需要我们包括中美在内的全球各国加强协作，形成共识，积极应对。
President Biden is really hoping that we can advance the climate agenda. And China and the United States are the 2 most powerful economies in the world. We also happen to be the 2 largest emitters of greenhouse gases. And so the imperative of our 2 countries coming together and working and showing the rest of the world how we can cooperate and begin to address this with the urgency it requires is incredible.
We chatted with Anurag Viswanath about Kerry's visit. She's a China policies analyst at Institute of Chinese Studies. So John Kerry arrived in China during one of the hottest summers ever recorded in Beijing. The US is also seeing record temperatures. If nothing else works, global heating should bring these 2 countries together, right?
Yes, global warming is a new reality. China touched actually 52.2 in Xinjiang and 53.3 in Death Valley in the US. So it's a common challenge. And of course, if you look at the context, Kerry's visit follows the visit by Anthony Blinken and the US Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen. So this is actually an effort to re-engage with China, to reach out to China on a common challenge.
I know Chinese officials, though, worry about Washington's climate policy, that the US could expand restrictions on battery imports after the USA may cancel a grant to Microvast Holdings when lawmakers express concern over its alleged links to China's government. And of course, there are other issues concerning renewables that China's concerned about. What has China said about the US's Inflation Reduction Act?
Well, the Inflation Reduction Act is actually the biggest piece of climate legislation by the US. And it seeks to give tax breaks, tax incentives, tax credit to individuals or businesses which produce clean energy. And by clean energy, basically non-fossil fuel or non-carbon like geothermal or wind. So basically, as you know, China is the world's largest emitter. It is the world's second largest economy. But Kerry also emphasized that China is one of the largest, one of the biggest, supporters of producers and supporters of renewable energy, solar power and wind power. So that often gets hidden. That is not often emphasized. Also, you have to look at the context. The population of the US, about 350 million, and the population of China, the world's largest emitter, and India, so roughly about 1.4 billion. So the per capita emission is possibly greater in the US than in China. So that is what China has been indicating, and it does not want to be penalized. It wants to come down on coal sometime in 2026, not before that.
On this show, we've talked a lot about the US's successes and failures when it comes to climate action. China, not so much. I mean, as you just mentioned, China's emissions more than double those of the US. The two combined account for about, I think it's 40% of global emissions. Talk about what China is doing to transition away from oil and particularly coal, which accounts, I believe, for about 60% of the country's total energy generation. President Xi did say China will reach peak carbon emissions by 2030 and become carbon neutral by 2060. But is that even possible at this point? I mean, China's been building new coal-fired power plants for energy security after months of power shortages in the last 2 years.
Well, the energy security situation is very fluid, largely because of the Ukraine war. So, the world itself is in crisis. The oil prices are, just very, very unstable. So at this point in time, China's coal imports have been going up, and so has its gas imports. So regarding, coming down on coal, China has committed to these broad goals. But it has also at the same time been investing heavily in wind, thermal, geothermal, and solar power. So China, in fact, leads in renewables. It's one of the largest producers and supporters of renewables, and that is something that is often glossed over.
Before I let you go, Anurag, do we know much about what, if any, deals have been made between China and the US to work together towards keeping global temperatures well below 2 degrees Celsius?
Well, this was a very symbolic visit, a very meaningful visit. The idea to engage China, to reach out to China, US to lead by example, US getting China together to lead by example, to set an example for developing countries. That was an incredibly powerful message, not only to China, to America, and to the rest of the world.
All right, let's hope this symbolic visit turns out to be a lot more than that. Thank you so much, Anurag, for your time.
Thank you so much, Reagan.
The activist group Last Generation blocked roads as part of a nationwide protest against what they see as inefficient climate policies in Germany. They glued themselves to the asphalt and wore masks, mocking prominent policymakers. The activists were met with a fierce backlash from the police and the public. The German government recently approved Climate Change Act amendments that will allow the agriculture, industry and transport sectors to ignore carbon dioxide emissions limits.
Vielen Menschen in der Gesellschaft ist bewusst, dass wir in eine Klimakatastrophe rasen. Und vielen wird auch immer bewusster, dass meine aktuelle Regierung nicht genug tut, um dem entgegenzutreten. Wir wollen aber weiter die Gesellschaft darüber aufklären und deswegen treten wir auf die Straße, um das allen öffentlich zu machen.
When it comes to checking the health of coral reefs, scientists have looked at seaweed for decades. But new research by the University of British Columbia reveals that this approach may be deceptive. Researchers assumed macroalgae, another name for seaweed, grows faster as a result of human activity that damages reefs. But the study, published in the journal Global Change Biology, looked at data from more than 1,200 sites over 16 years and found some types of seaweed suffer from things like pollution and global warming, while other kinds thrive, causing scientists to misidentify which reefs are the most endangered. Dr. Pia Winberg is Director and Chief Scientist at Vignes Shell Systems, a company that grows seaweed biomass for use in cosmetics and pharmaceuticals. What are your initial thoughts about this study that looked at data from more than 1,200 sites over more than a decade and suggests not all seaweed types thrive in pollution? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's not really surprising, because it's a little bit like saying all animals would be the same, and they're obviously not. So not all seaweeds are the same. And it's quite a big thing that we've got to start communicating, is that the diversity of seaweeds, their role in ecosystem, their response to pollution or toxins or disturbance is very different and particular to each species. And people in their minds today still think seaweeds are seaweeds, but they're actually more diverse than most of the organisms on the planet. So it's just a lesson in do not simplify everything.
So the study says sargassum, a type of seaweed, is less likely to grow in water contaminated by agricultural runoff, but Halimeda, another type, will thrive. In both cases, a reef will suffer. Does this significantly change the approach of using seaweed specifically to determine the health of a coral reef?
We can still use the broad concept that coral reefs generally don't have a lot of seaweeds, and if coral reefs are smothered in seaweeds, they're not going to thrive. So that still holds, because coral reefs actually need sunlight. They have their own algae in their tissues, and they need the sunlight to photosynthesize. So if they're shaded by seaweeds, that's generally not a good thing. They're being outcompeted. And so broadly, the message is still there that a lot of seaweeds on top of coral reefs just isn't good. But just the fact that seaweeds exist in and around certain coral reefs is not a sign that the reef is either unhealthy or that there's nutrient runoff. So as you said, sargassum doesn't respond well to nitrogen sources that are typically from agriculture and coastal pollution, whereas things like sea lettuce and Halimeda, like you said, actually do. And it's also how those organisms thrive in a rock pool. You know, a rock pool, if you look into it, has many different species of seaweeds living together. And the reason they can live together is because they're all eating different parts of the nutrient spectrum. So you get a green seaweed in there that gobbles up the nitrogen, a red seaweed there that's focusing on the phosphorus, and all these other species, they sort of collaborate, and in the end, they've cleaned up the ecosystem for us. And so we just need to start to learn to understand that, yeah, seaweeds as a whole are fewer on a coral reef, but you can't use them just black and white as an indicator of exactly what's going on, because they all do different things.
I'm glad you brought up photosynthesize earlier. Just talk briefly about the actual function of seaweed. And is it like any other plant that is helpful in absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere?
Very much so. Just like plants, they actually are the ancestors to plants, especially the green seaweeds are ancestors to all land plants. And so they created the first oxygen along with small algae, and they continue to produce a big chunk of the oxygen that we have on the earth today and take up a big chunk of the carbon dioxide. And what's exciting is that seaweeds, and we actually farm a seaweed here in Australia, that we can grow seaweed about 50 times faster in a given area than land crops, which means that we can take up carbon dioxide 50 times faster in a patch of space on Earth. And so that's exciting, because it's one of the methods by which we can start to look at more sustainable crops and ecosystems that help us achieve fewer greenhouse gas emissions. It doesn't mean it's the single solution and we can just grow seaweed to solve the problem, but it will be a big contributor to a more sustainable planet.
And that's it for this episode of Just 2 Degrees. Before we go, take a look at this. We don't always consider them, but animals too are prone to extreme heat. But these in the Gaza Strip are getting help from volunteers at the Solala Animal Shelter. Until next time.